Donald Trump, under the cover of the war in the Middle East, decided to finally lift the oil sanctions imposed on Russia. Earlier, the US suspended sanctions against Russian oil and the shadow fleet because of the war in Iran, but only for a month and only for India. The White House allowed India to buy Russian oil that had already been loaded onto tankers, in order to ease the oil crisis caused by the war in the key oil-producing region of the planet, the Persian Gulf. But today, US Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent said that Washington may continue to ease the sanctions regime on Russian oil exports due to the ongoing military actions in the Middle East. He said that as long as the war continues, the US may completely lift oil sanctions from the Kremlin, and here is the first consequence. Russian Urals oil is being sold at a premium to the Brent benchmark for the first time. This is happening in Indian ports amid rising demand. The price of the Brent benchmark basket has increased by 25% over the past week, reaching almost $90 per barrel. At the same time, Urals prices have outpaced this growth, actually rising by 50%. And that's not all. I'm Alex Cipechi, let's discuss this together. But before we start, I ask you to subscribe to this channel, like this episode, and leave any comment under this video, so that YouTube's algorithms recommend this episode to as many viewers as possible. And please subscribe to my Telegram channel, Pechi News. The link is in the description of this video. There we publish breaking news as it comes in. So, while everyone is distracted by the war against Iran, Donald Trump decided to help Vladimir Putin and is lifting oil sanctions against Russia. Washington may continue to ease the sanctions regime on Russian oil exports due to the ongoing military actions in the Middle East. This was stated by the head of the United States Department of the Treasury, Scott Bessent. Here is his quote: "Due to the temporary oil shortage on the global market, we allowed India to accept Russian oil. We can also lift the sanctions on the supply of other Russian oil." And according to Bessent, hundreds of millions of barrels of sanctioned oil are currently already on tankers at sea. And the US is considering lifting restrictions on the sale of these volumes in order to create an oversupply. Washington will announce the decisions made to ease tensions in the oil market caused by the effective closure of the Strait of Hormuz due to the war against Iran. I remind you, just a day earlier, Donald Trump said there were no more problems, the Strait of Hormuz was unblocked, and everything was under control. Therefore, tankers can move freely there. And this shocked many people, even more than the previous statement by the same Scott Bessent. On March 6, the US suspended sanctions against Russian oil and the shadow fleet because of the war in the Middle East, but only for a month and only for India. The White House allowed India to buy Russian oil that had already been loaded onto tankers in order to ease the oil crisis caused by the war. The war in the key oil-producing region of the planet, that is, in the Persian Gulf. And just yesterday, Bessent himself insisted that, quote, "it was intentional." The short-term measure will not bring significant financial benefits to the Russian authorities, since it only allows transactions with oil that is already at sea. India and China have been the main buyers of sanctioned Russian oil after Russia's invasion of Ukraine. However, right before the attack on Iran, the US, with sanctions and tariffs, convinced India to wind down its oil trade with the wild Russians. As a result, significant volumes of Russian oil ended up stranded at sea on tankers, waiting for buyers. And Putin was offering absolutely astronomical discounts on this oil that was stuck on tankers in the open sea just so that someone would buy it. But nobody wanted to deal with the Russians, and this oil just sat on tankers in the open sea for weeks, waiting for someone to buy it. And at that time, oil companies in Russia were already being forced to cut production because there was nowhere to store this oil. But here it's important to immediately explain one very important point in order to be more objective. Analysts warned that India would have resumed buying this oil anyway, even if the US hadn't lifted the sanctions, for two reasons. First, India is bigger. Major world economies will suffer from the US war with Iran since they received almost half of all imported oil through the Strait of Hormuz, and India has virtually no strategic reserves. While China has accumulated reserves that can fully replace all oil imports for 3 to 6 months, India has reserves for, at best, a few weeks. Secondly, India has only recently stopped large-scale purchases of cheap oil, sanctioned Russian oil, and it has plenty of established schemes and connections with Russian sellers and the shadow fleet to quickly resume this trade. India hasn't said goodbye to it for that long. But there's another truth as well. Easing sanctions and rising oil prices benefit Russia, no matter how much the American Secretary of the Treasury, Bessent, tries to convince us otherwise. Before the US and Israel attacked Iran, Russia was selling less and less oil and gas abroad due to Western sanctions against the Kremlin and the shadow tanker fleet. As of March 4th, there were officially 120 million barrels of Russian oil at sea on tankers. A significant portion of these volumes did not have a final buyer. And most of these shadow fleet tankers are now anchored in Asian waters near the Indian coast. After the sanctions are lifted from India, it will be much easier for Russia to sell this oil, and not only easier, but also at a higher price. And here's the news that followed these statements by Scott Bessent. Russian Urals oil is being sold at a premium for the first time to the Brent benchmark when delivered to Indian ports amid increased demand related to the war in the Middle East. The price of the Brent benchmark basket has increased by 25% over the past week to almost $90 per barrel. At the same time, prices for Russian Urals have outpaced this growth, actually rising by 50% to 68.6%, from the initial $45 per barrel at the end of February. That means the price increase for Russian oil is twice as much as for American oil. Since 2022, Russian oil has been traded in India at a discount of several dollars to Brent, because Moscow was forced to redirect exports to Asia after the European Union imposed an embargo on purchases of Russian raw materials. Indian refiners have actively used oil from the Russian Federation in recent years. But now this brazen Russia can overcharge for this oil. Taking advantage of the market situation, Russia was ready to pay extra itself, offering huge discounts just so that someone would buy this oil. 120 million barrels of oil on tankers in the open sea is a huge amount, and as a result, Russia had nowhere left to store this oil. Besides that, whether such a move by the Trump administration will really help anyone else besides Russia? It won't be possible now to calm the global markets and avert the threat of a full-scale energy crisis in Europe and Asia. In the event of a prolonged closure of the Hormuz Strait, through which 25% of the world's oil and petroleum products from the Persian Gulf were supplied to the global market before the war. About 80% of all this went to Asia. That's why no Russian barrels will calm the situation. But only if Trump really goes for a complete lifting of sanctions against the Russian Federation, which Scott Bessent just started talking about now. But such a step also undermines the very idea of sanctions. The representative of the president of the Russian Federation, Kirill Dmitriev, has already stated that he is discussing with the American side the issue of easing restrictions on Russian oil, because, I quote, "Western sanctions, as practice has shown, cause damage to the global economy. This narrative is exactly what Russia has been unsuccessfully promoting since 2014. And for the first time, it got the chance to use this argument as a trump card." I'll leave it at that. Share your opinions and conclusions in the comments below this episode. Subscribe to the channel, hit the bell, and don't forget to like. If you found this episode interesting and useful, you can support the work of this YouTube channel financially. Subscribe, hit the like button if you enjoyed this video, subscribe to the channel, and don't forget to hit the bell. Take care. In the description of this video or by QR code, your recommendations for advertising are welcome. See you next time, and I will be grateful for any support you can provide. That's all. Take care. Subtitles?